In this episode, we talk about one of India's most ambitious infrastructure projects. We also take a look at Bihar's voting rights crisis just months before the assembly elections. But we begin today by discussing the upcoming India and US trade deal. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. The pause that US President Donald Trump had placed on reciprocal tariffs against India and other countries comes to an end on Wednesday. That is the 9th of July. And while Indian negotiators have been working hard to strike a trade deal with the US in hopes of avoiding these tariffs, a breakthrough remains elusive. In fact, just last week, Trump said the US has already begun notifying countries about the reciprocal tariffs they will have to pay. Now, according to sources, while many issues around traded goods have been resolved, at least 4 agricultural products remain points of contention. These are corn, dairy products, ethanol, and soya bean. So to understand the concerns on both sides over these items and how agriculture fits into the larger trade deal, my colleague Niharika Nanda speaks with the Indian Express's National Rural Affairs and Agriculture Editor, Harish Damodaran.
Harish, in the ongoing trade negotiations between India and the US, what role does agriculture play? How significant is it compared to other goods?
Yeah, I suppose that agriculture is a major stumbling block. On the one hand, India wants more open access for its products such as, say, textiles, footwear, pharma, auto components, and many things, right? Where it already has a market. Even things like, say, shrimp. Right? I mean, we already have a market there. So we don't want that market to go. And if anything, we want it to expand, right? I mean, tomorrow, if the reciprocal tariffs were to come, say 26% or something, it's going to be very difficult. But on the other hand, the US, and Trump is a very hard at bargaining. He says, so indirectly what they are saying is, okay, we'll open these markets. We won't charge high tariffs, but provided you open up agriculture, okay? So
it's like a bargaining chip.
Yeah. So I think the main problem with the negotiations where it is getting a little deadlocked is agriculture. And India is not all that willing to open up its agriculture. Whereas Trump really wants, American produce to be sold freely in India, because if you look at Trump's mass base, Trump swept what is called the corn belt of the US, which grows bulk of their, whether it is maize, whether it is wheat, or whether it is soybean, that entire stretch, basically Midwest, which they call, from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Missouri, that entire belt. And some of it is also part of the Rust Belt. And these belts, they overwhelmingly voted for Trump. So he obviously has to return that favor. Okay. So therefore, he wants India to import more of US corn. Corn is basically maize, what we call,
And you write that India has certain red lines when it comes to agriculture, especially for certain crops. Could you talk about what these are?
So there are 2 red lines. One is obviously whatever economic and political, you can call it economic and political because the sheer number of farmers, I think the total area in India which grows soybean is something like 12 million hectares, So if you take an average holding of 1 hectare, it means we are talking of about, say, over a crore farmers who are just soybean farmers. And then you have maize. Maize is grown in a very large way in Bihar, which goes for elections, in November. So both these are very sensitive crops. And of course, milk is farmed by farmers all across India. So I would say that these 3 are the main crops. And of course, ethanol is derived from maize, So to that extent, so the US is the world's biggest producer as well as an exporter of both maize and ethanol. So there is both an economic and a political side. But the third thing is you can call it, say, cultural. Okay, like almost the entire corn, that is maize, and the soybean which the US grows is genetically modified. India doesn't permit genetically modified maize or soybean. And the same comes to milk, right? The American dairy farmers, feed their cattle with a lot of animal origin products, like say blood meal. Basically, blood meal is a source of protein, okay? Whereas in India, we obviously don't feed. Our cows and buffaloes are purely vegetarian. So as I said, the first is economic, second is political, and the third is cultural. The fact that we won't accept milk which is coming from animals which have been fed animal origin feed.
And Harish, if we look at it crop by crop, starting from corn, the US is the world's largest producer and exporter of maize. While India does grow its own crop, how is it expected to impact the trade deal between the two countries?
See, the US and China have a trade war going on between them. And so far, China was the largest market for American soybean, and also corn, also cotton. Okay, they were very big buyers. But today, with a trade war kind of a thing, now China is saying that, hey man, we'll buy soybean from Brazil, we'll buy corn from Argentina. Okay, so China is scouting for alternate suppliers. So therefore, the US needs alternate buyers. Okay, and India is potentially a large market. And if you look at corn and soybean, what are these? Corn is basically a feed grain. Very little of corn is consumed directly. The bulk of the corn which farmers grow, it all goes basically as cattle feed, as poultry feed or as livestock feed. And our consumption of milk is increasing. Our consumption of chicken is increasing. Our consumption of fish is increasing. So all these things require maize as a vital ingredient, So the maize supplies the calories, okay? The maize supplies the carbohydrates, okay, for feed. Soybean, on the other hand, it supplies the soya meal. When I extract oil from the soybean, what remains is called the de-oil cake. It's also called meal. And that is very rich in protein. And that is the one which supplies the protein for the chicken and for our buffaloes and for our, So the Americans have figured out that India is a potentially large market, because this is a country where the consumption of milk, animal foods is increasing, and it is going to increase, with rising incomes, right? And that is how they see India as a potential market.
Right. And now moving on from corn, let's talk about ethanol. You write that India only allows its import under an actual user license and only for non-fuel industrial purposes. Talk about what exactly that means.
So maize, basically, what is maize? Maize is nothing but starch. Okay, it contains starch. Now, that starch can be used as a source of calories for animals. But that starch, I can also ferment it. I can ferment and make ethanol from it. Okay. So India has had this program for blending ethanol with petrol, up to 20%. We allow up to 20% blending of ethanol with petrol. And ethanol comes from sugarcane. It comes from sugarcane molasses. It comes from maize. It comes from, rice. So what has happened is more and more of our maize is now getting diverted for making ethanol. And our ethanol program is probably going to expand in the coming years. In the coming years, now they're saying that by 2030, we will increase the blending percentage from 20% to 30%. And plus, there is a plan of blending ethanol in diesel up to 5%. And plus, there is talk of ethanol being used even for making ultimately what they call a sustainable aircraft fuel. So even your flights will have ethanol which is coming from either from sugar or from maize or something. So again, the Americans have figured out that this is something which is going to be a huge market. So they obviously want a share of that. So therefore, the Americans are saying, hey man, you buy maize from us. You can use it for either producing ethanol, or you buy directly ethanol from us, Whereas India is saying, okay, we'll allow ethanol, but not for fuel ethanol, but it's okay. We'll import ethanol for our pharma industry, for our beverages, for all these things, but not fuel ethanol.
And now, Harish, if we talk about soybean, India imports genetically modified soybean oil. But tell us, what exactly does US want India to do?
See, oil per se is not genetically modified because oil only contains fat. Fat doesn't contain any protein material. When we say genetically modified, that is only present in the raw bean or in the de-oil cake. So the meal, because meal contains protein, right? I mean, I'm giving the de-oil cake basically to the animals. Why? To meet its protein requirements. So you have genetic material only either in the raw bean or in the oil. So India imports genetically modified soybean oil, which is free from the genetic material. Okay. So India right now only imports soybean oil, and we import soybean oil mostly, I think, from Argentina and Brazil. And US is not a very big player in oil, but US is a very big player in bean. So the Americans would want us to import soybean. Okay, we have a problem because it is genetically modified, right? So ultimately, it's a very, like as we say, ये film में suspense है, emotion है. So in this thing, इसमें सब कुछ है, economics है, politics है, and there is also culture, and from both sides.
Right, and dairy, like we of course talked about earlier as well. Despite US wanting us to import dairy products, it doesn't seem likely that we are going to do that. So is that going to be a big issue?
So my feeling is the Americans are more or less reconciled that India won't open up the dairy market. And one reason is also the cultural thing, right? I mean, as I said in the beginning, because their animals are fed on animal products, whereas our cattle and buffaloes are all pure vegetarians, right? So they realize that there is an emotional angle, cultural angle. But my feeling is that they will use that in turn. Okay, hey man, okay, you don't buy our milk, but then you better buy our corn. You better buy our soybean. So overall, it adds up to a very interesting kind of a situation, right?
And Harish, it's been months since we've been trying to close this deal with the US, right? But so far, nothing conclusive seems to have happened. So how do we see this playing out in the future?
I don't know. So it is possible. I don't know. See, because we don't know. It may be announced today, tomorrow, anytime. We could have a partial deal, where we agree to everything. Say, for example, we may say, okay, we are willing to cut import duties on whiskey, on spirits, maybe on your almonds, walnuts, avocados, all these kind of things. But let's leave the rest of agriculture, for another day. So it is possible that, some of the sensitive items may be left behind. I think that is the optimistic case from India's perspective. We don't know because, Trump is very, he's a hardcore bully, right? I mean, so you don't know. So I suppose the best case scenario for India would be a partial deal, where we say, hey, come on, let's keep the, negotiations going, on agriculture, etc. for a later day, let's keep that separate, but let's agree to all other things. What is it? And please don't impose, reciprocal tariffs on us, Then I think that's where it is going to be. So it depends on who blinks first, Let's see what happens.
And next we take a look inside one of India's most ambitious infrastructure projects. This is the 5-kilometer long and 8-lane tunnel cutting through the Mukundra Hills in Kota, Rajasthan. This tunnel, part of the 1,300-kilometer Delhi-Mumbai Expressway, is scheduled to be one of the widest tunnels ever built in the country.
So this tunnel is very important for two reasons.
This is the Indian Express's Dheeraj Mishra, who reported on this story for the paper.
First, it falls on the stretch of Delhi-Mumbai Expressway, which is one of the most ambitious, project of National Highway Authority of India, which is implementing the project. And second reason is that after completion, it is going to be one of the widest transportation tunnel in India. It is 22 meters wide, and the height of the tunnel is 11 meters. So for the first time in India, we will have an 8-lane tunnel. Currently, most of the tunnel that we have, road tunnels, it is mostly either 4-lane, or there are some few places where there is 6-lane tunnel. But this tunnel will be 8-lane, 4-lane on either side. So that is very important, which makes it, one of the very ambitious project. And also the another reason is that the tunnel fall in the Rajasthan's Kota district. And the tunnel is being built under the Mukundra Hills. Mukundra is a tiger reserve area. It's a protected area. And the tunnel is being passing under the Mukundra Hill.
Dheeraj tells us that the terrain here is geologically diverse and fragile, made up of layers of sandstone, shale, siltstone, mudstone, and limestone. But these layers aren't stable. They are highly fractured and prone to water seepage.
Currently, the engineers at the spot, they said that they are facing multiple challenges to break through the tunnel from one side to another side. And because of its formation, because the formation of the hill, it's not very compact.
In fact, a geologist on the project told the Indian Express that the team came across much softer rock formations than they had anticipated. And to make matters even more challenging, heavy groundwater seeped in, flooding parts of the tunnel during the monsoons between 2022 and 2024. All of this slowed the progress to just 1.2 meters of excavation per day in some stretches.
So what happens when you start excavating a mountain? So if it is not a very hard rock, there is a very high possibility that when you will start, when you just imagine that when you will start doing the encircling the mountain, it may collapse very easily. And what happens, the mountains also shrink as you get deeper inside the mountain. It starts shrinking and it comes to a point where it can collapse, and the whole process, the whole engineering will come back to the zero. So the engineers are facing problem to break through, to go from one side to another side. Technically, the breakthrough of the tunnel has been completed. So both the tunnel which were being excavated from north side and south side, they have met at a point which is called breakthrough. But that very breakthrough point is very fragile. It is not yet complete. The tunnel is open from both the sides. I mean, the tunnel have met at a point, but there are a lot of work still remaining, which is called benching. Benching exercise in the tunnel is the lower portion of the tunnel is yet to be excavated and the process is still ongoing. So what they are doing, I mean, there is a 500-meter stretch. When we visited the site, engineers, they explained the whole geology, the whole complexity and the whole challenge of making a tunnel. And they said that, because there is a possibility, because the formation, it changes from every 2-3 meters. So that is why they cannot deploy they cannot employ the same technology, same technique in excavating that engineers did, let's say, 1 or 2 meters back.
So basically, in such stretches, the risk of collapse is very high. So to tackle this, engineers are using pilot tunneling, a technique where a smaller tunnel is dug up first to reduce the pressure on the main structure. Now, Dheeraj tells us that according to the original timeline, contractors had 30 months to finish the job, so by January 2024. But the excavation challenges have of course pushed things back. The new target now is the end of this year, with vehicle movement expected by March 2026. And to make things even more complex, the tunnel also cuts through an eco-sensitive zone, something that's drawn concern from the forest and wildlife departments.
So technically, the whole stretch of the tunnel, it is around 5 kilometers. To be specific, it is 4.9 kilometers. So out of that 4.9 kilometers, the actual excavation is to be done in 3.3 kilometers, which is going under the Mukundra Hills. And at the rest part of it, the engineers have to create a tunnel. I mean, that is the open area, but they have to create it tunnel to complete the stretch of the 4.9 kilometer in a tunnel form. So the rest of the portion where, excavation is not required, it is called cut and cover. So upon completion, it will take a form of complete tunnel. It is being done on the objection that was raised by the Environment Ministry and Forest. They said that you have to do this whole stretch into the tunnel form so that there is a presence of a number of vulnerable wildlife animals and their habitation will be disturbed if you will not create this extra portion in the form of the tunnel, though it is on the plain surface. So the cut and cover, it is being created, it is being constructed to allow the animal to pass from one side to another side without any hindrance.
But beyond the cut and cover and other challenges, Dheeraj says safety remains a top priority. Once excavation is complete, the tunnel will be equipped with a SCADA-controlled safety system, which stands for the Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition.
Learning from the past experiences, because, in the process of this whole tunneling, once you excavate the tunnel, another major challenge is to ensure the security and safety inside it. Because, once some untoward incident happens, let's say there is any fire. So how would you evacuate the passengers? How would you evacuate the whole, people who are inside the tunnel? So that is why this safety system has to be very robust, and they have started deploying it. I mean, there is a power supply, there is ventilation system, firefighting, hydrant system, fire alarm, gas suppression, of course, CCTV cameras, telephone, gas sensors, signages, radio broadcasting system. These are some of the key equipment, or you can say instruments that has been installed or will be installed in the other stretches of the tunnel. And that is going to ensure the safety of the commuters who will pass through the tunnel once it will become operational.
And in the end, we turn to Bihar, where the state is facing a major voting rights crisis just months before the assembly elections. The Election Commission's special intensive revision of electoral rolls has triggered alarm with a 24th June directive asking all voters to revalidate their electoral status by submitting one of 11 approved documents. Activists warn this could disenfranchise over 3 crore voters, especially from marginalized communities, as common IDs like Aadhaar and ration cards aren't accepted. In fact, on the 4th of July, the Association for Democratic Reforms moved the Supreme Court, calling the directive arbitrary and unconstitutional. And political activist Yogendra Yadav also filed a petition arguing that the burden of proof unfairly shifts to citizens, violating key constitutional rights. Now, the immediate impact and its strain on the administration is evident. So far, over 68 million enumeration forms have been handed out, with booth-level officers struggling to manage thousands of documents due for digital upload by the 26th of July. Now, in response to mounting chaos, Bihar's chief electoral officer has allowed voters to submit forms without documents for now, saying the paperwork will be submitted later. But this move, however, has not eased the legal and constitutional concerns raised by petitioners. Besides this, critics also question the timing, pointing out that a special summary revision was already completed earlier this year. Opposition parties have also mobilized against the revision, with independent MP Rajesh Ranjan announcing a Bihar Bandh on the 9th of July and RJD leader Tejasvi Yadav calling it an assault on democracy. The Supreme Court now faces a critical decision, with the final electoral rolls scheduled to be ready by the 30th of September. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Niharika Nanda and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.